The crosshairs settled on the chest, thin, narrow, the uniform 3 sizes too big. Movement in the tree line had triggered the response. Weapon up, sight picture, finger on the trigger. 2 seconds of muscle memory from months of combat across France, Belgium, the frozen Ardennes. And then the face turned, 14 years old, maybe 13. The rifle in the kid's hands was older than the kid holding it. A Guy Vert 98 from the First War. Woodstock, scarred and pitted. Iron sights designed for men who had died before this boy was born. The helmet slid over his eyes. His hands shook so badly the rifle barrel traced figure 8s against the grey winter sky. Tears had frozen on cheeks that had never felt a razor. He was crying. He was also pointing a weapon at an American squad that had just watched 2 of its men die. The sergeant had 2 seconds to decide what kind of man he was. This moment repeated itself across 1,000 villages in the final winter of 1945. American infantrymen advanced through frozen German terrain, expecting Wehrmacht veterans, SS fanatics, the hardened military machine that had conquered Europe in 6 weeks. What they found instead, with sickening frequency, were children. Boys as young as 8 were captured manning artillery positions. Children 12 and under-operated anti-aircraft batteries in the final desperate defence of the Reich. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had already lost 60% of its strength in Normandy. Most of those bodies had belonged to teenagers who had never voted, never held a job, never kissed a girl in peacetime. The replacements filling German positions by January 1945 were even younger. You need to understand what this did to the American soldiers who encountered it. The propaganda had prepared them for monsters. The newsreels showed goose-stepping legions. The training films depicted hardened Nazis. The chaplains spoke of righteous war against evil. Every message from home confirmed that the Germans were the enemy, and the enemy must be destroyed. Nobody had prepared them for a 13-year-old sobbing in a foxhole. The famous photograph of Hans-Georg Henke shows what American soldiers saw through their rifle sights. A 16-year-old German. His face contorted in absolute collapse. His uniform hanging off a frame that had not finished growing. The tears, the terror, the total disintegration of everything he had been told to believe. He was not an exception. He was the enemy in spring 1945. And American soldiers had to figure out, in the space of a heartbeat, whether to kill him. The internal calculus was impossible. This child had been shooting at your squad. This child might have killed the man you shared cigarettes with yesterday. This child wore the uniform of an enemy you had been trained to hate since Pearl Harbor. But this child was also, unmistakably, a child. Shaking, terrified, dressed in clothes that did not fit, holding a weapon he barely knew how to use. The war demanded you pull the trigger. Something deeper demanded you lower the rifle. Your brain tried to hold both categories simultaneously, threat and child, enemy and victim, kill target and kid, who looks like your younger brother back in Ohio. The categories could not coexist. Your nervous system tried to resolve the paradox and failed. That failure was the moment. That failure was where everything that came next was decided. Most chose mercy. The evidence is in the numbers. Approximately 10,000 young fighters from the Hitler Youth were taken prisoner by American forces in the final push into Germany. This counts only those who surrendered and were processed. It does not include those killed in combat before they could give up. It does not include those whose ages were never recorded. 10,000 child prisoners means 10,000 decisions to accept surrender rather than pull the trigger. These were not official orders. No regulation instructed American soldiers to spare enemy combatants based on age. The Geneva Convention did not distinguish between a 14-year-old with a rifle and a 40-year-old with the same weapon. Each captured child represented a moment when an American soldier looked through his sights, saw a kid, and chose not to fire. 1,000 small rebellions against the logic of war. 1,000 men who decided that killing children, even children who had been trying to kill them, was a line they would not cross. But then came the paperwork. Germany would surrender over 2.8 million soldiers to Western Allied forces between D-Day and the end of April 1945. Over 1.5 million of those surrenders occurred in April alone. The processing system was designed for throughput, search, document, transport, hold, efficient, mechanical, built for volume. It was not designed for prisoners who weighed 90 pounds and cried when you took their weapons. The captured children became a crisis that no one had planned for. The field sergeants improvised. Some units began informal age screening at surrender points, pulling obviously underage captives out of the processing line. Others pushed everyone through the standard system because they had no alternative and no authority to create one. The chaos of the German collapse meant that procedures varied wildly. What emerged was not policy but patchwork. Individual decisions made by individual men who recognized that the standard approach was failing and had to figure out something different on the fly. The problem was not just logistical, it was psychological. American GIs who had captured these children now had to guard them. They had to look at the same faces that had been in their crosshairs hours earlier, and those faces were crying or sullen or terrified or sometimes still defiant. The cognitive dissonance was brutal. These kids had been trying to kill you this morning. Now they were your responsibility. Some of them still believed the propaganda. Some of them expected to be executed. Some of them asked for their mothers. The American soldiers guarding them had to somehow process the whiplash between enemy combatant and child in need of protection. The question echoed up the chain of command. What do we actually do with these kids? The POW system was built for soldiers. These were children who had been failed by every adult in their lives, handed weapons, and told to die for a regime that was already collapsing. Treating them as conventional prisoners meant holding them indefinitely in camps designed for hardened combatants. Releasing them meant setting free children who might pick up rifles again, or who might simply starve in the rubble of a destroyed country. Neither option was acceptable. A third path had to be built from nothing. The solution that emerged sent between 7,000 and 10,000 Hitler Youth children to specialized facilities, including a POW camp at Attichy in northern France that was converted specifically for juvenile prisoners. The GIs assigned to these facilities found themselves in a situation that nothing had prepared them for. They were combat soldiers, infantrymen, men trained to kill Germans, not teach them. Now they were running what amounted to a school for former enemies. Children who had been shooting at American troops weeks earlier. Children who had been taught that Americans were subhuman. Children who in some cases still believed the propaganda even as the Reich collapsed around them. The curriculum that developed was designed to attack everything these kids had been taught. Philosophy courses introduced Plato and the Western intellectual tradition that Nazi ideology had rejected. The camps operated on principles of self-governance. The children elected their own judges to adjudicate disputes, a direct assault on the authoritarianism they had been raised within. The goal was explicit: produce young Germans who could participate in democracy. Whether it would work was anyone's guess. These kids had been taught to hate everything American since before they could read. Now, American soldiers were trying to save them from themselves. Some children proved unreachable, their indoctrination too deep, their trauma too severe. Others cracked almost immediately. The propaganda had been held together by the appearance of German strength. Once that illusion shattered, everything else came apart too. They had been told Germans were the master race. Now they were prisoners. They had been told the Führer was infallible. Now he was dead in a bunker. The Americans, who were supposed to be monsters, were offering them chocolate and cigarettes and philosophy lessons. The world they had been taught to believe in did not exist. Some of them fell into that void and never climbed out. But others, thousands of them, began the slow process of becoming something other than what they had been made. The children they faced and chose to save became early subjects of a humanitarian principle that was still taking shape. That children conscripted into war belong in schools, not in prisons, and certainly not in graves. The Geneva Conventions would later be amended. The United Nations would develop protocols for child combatants. Modern military doctrine would address scenarios that American sergeants in 1945 improvised their way through with no guidance. They were not taught this. They were not ordered to do this. They simply understood, in their bones, if not in their regulations, that the war they were fighting was against a regime, not against its youngest victims. The shaking children in oversized uniforms were not Nazis. They were children who had been failed by every adult in their lives. And the Americans who captured them instead of killing them, who built facilities for juvenile prisoners instead of standard POW pens, who taught Plato instead of demanding confessions. These men recognized something that no regulation had anticipated. Mercy, in certain circumstances, is not weakness. It is the highest form of victory. They defeated Nazi Germany, and then they saved its children.